Good evening and a warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Our online series of talks and conversations continues with our guest, the reporter, editor and author, Jonathan Kaufman. I'll introduce Jonathan in just a moment. I beg your pardon, Jonathan Kaufman. I'll introduce Jonathan in just a moment. Welcome to you wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. And I'd particularly like to welcome viewers in Canada, in Ireland, and in Israel. Please do ask questions. You can do this at any time you like by using the Q&A facility on your screen and typing in whatever it is you'd like to ask. And as always, we will try our best to get through as many of your questions as possible. Please also be aware of the chat facility, which allows you to send a message or a comment to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, this event is being recorded and it will be posted on the Milim website at milim.org.uk towards the end of this week. Recordings of our prior events are on the website, as well as details of our packed future events for which you can book tickets. And so to our speaker this evening. Jonathan Kaufman is a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, editor, and author. Educated at Yale and Harvard universities, he has written and reported on China for more than 30 years. He covered the 1989 massacre in Tiananmen Square for the Boston Globe, was China bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal from 2002 to 2005, and has also written for Bloomberg News. Tonight, he's speaking about his excellent book, The Kings of Shanghai, which describes two rival dynasties and the parts they played in the creation of modern China. Tonight, Jonathan joins us from Vermont. Welcome, Jonathan. Lovely to have you. Looking forward to hearing you. Over to you.
Thanks very much, and thank you for having me. I thought I would start out by sort of talking a little bit about how I became interested in this topic, because while the Sasson family is actually well known in Britain, it's not well known at all in the United States. And the Kaduri family also, their story has really not been well told. And the whole idea of writing about Jews in China, I think, is something that surprises people when I begin to talk about it and when I wrote about it. My own interest in this topic began as a reporter when I first went to China in the late 1970s. I was right out of university, was a young foreign correspondent, and was walking along the streets of Shanghai down by the Bund, that beautiful Art Deco waterfront, and I had to use the bathroom. Now, you have to remember, this was a time when it was still Red China. Mao had only died just a few years before. Everyone was still wearing those blue Chinese Mao suits. There were far more bicycles than cars on the street. And things were really very locked down, very, very communist, still very isolated. And so, as I say, I was walking along the street, I had to use the restroom, and I went into a hotel. And it was like walking into a 1930s movie set. It was the floors were marble, there were these beautiful crystal chandeliers, Lalique lamp fixtures on the walls, and a bellhop all dressed in white with a little white cap came up to me. And when I asked him in English if I could use the bathroom, he responded to me in French. So I left this hotel kind of wondering what explained this anachronism in the middle of communist China. And someone told me that this hotel had been built by a British Playboy millionaire, Viktor Sasson, a Jewish Playboy millionaire who had lived in Shanghai in the 1920s and 1930s. So I kind of filed that away the way reporters often do when we're kind of covering stories, went on to do the interviews on other topics I was planning. A few years later, I was back in Shanghai doing some more reporting, and the Chinese at this point were assigning minders essentially to the foreign journalists. These were kind of officials who would travel with you all the time to make sure you didn't ask any embarrassing questions or didn't see anything that the communists didn't want you to see. And so this fellow said to me he wanted to take me to the Children's Palace, which he described as a place where Chinese parents on weekends would take their children for violin lessons, ballet lessons, things like that. So I thought I would go along. It seemed like a fun feature story to do. But when I got there, again, I had this incredible sense of incongruity. The Children's Palace, in fact, looked like a very large British manor house. It wouldn't have been out of place in Downton Abbey. There was a beautiful manicured lawns all around it. And when I went inside, while it was being used, there were children who were taking violin lessons there, Chinese children doing ballet lessons, putting on little theatrical performances. It had clearly once been a great house that had been lived in by an incredibly wealthy family. The ballroom was about the size of an American football field. There were sweeping staircases going up to the second floor. And as I left, I noticed a small plaque by the entrance, which said this had once been the home to the Kaduri family. Well, I knew the Kaduri family because I was based in Hong Kong at the time. The Kaduris were not only the most prominent Jewish family in Hong Kong, they were one of the richest and most powerful families. They had amassed a huge fortune in Hong Kong. They were very close to the Chinese government, very influential. But I had not known that they had a previous history in Shanghai. And then a number of years after that, I was based in Beijing as the bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal. And I went over there with my wife and our three young children who were young at the time. And the whole family, but especially the kids, loved going to Shanghai. It was interesting, it was adventurous. And so on weekends, we would often go down there and we loved exploring the city. And one Saturday, we were walking through an older part of Shanghai. And I noticed in the alleyways in some of the tenement buildings, on the doorposts of many of the houses, there were the shadows of mezuzahs. Not the mezuzahs themselves, but the shadows where they had once been. And again, I thought to myself, why would there be mezuzahs on the doorposts of these tenement homes in Shanghai? And of course, as I found out later, these had been left by some of the 18,000 Jewish refugees who had made their way to Shanghai and found refuge during the Second World War when they were trying to escape Nazism. So all these kind of moments and anecdotes began to lodge in my brain, and I decided to find out kind of what was behind it and what was the bigger story about these families and about the role they had played in China's tumultuous history. And the story really took me first to Baghdad. Now, when we talk about Jewish history, certainly Jewish history in the United States or in the UK or Canada, we often know the story of Fiddler on the Roof. I'm sure many of your families, certainly mine, trace their roots back to Poland or Russia or Germany, living in shtetls, living in ghettos, and then making their way up through various societies and achieving success in business or academics or the professions. But this story in Baghdad was actually very different. We first start reading about the Jews in Baghdad in the Bible, in that famous psalm which says, "By the rivers of Babylon we wept when we remembered Zion." Babylon was Baghdad. And the Jews of Babylon, of Baghdad, had actually been kidnapped by Nebuchadnezzar right after the destruction of the first temple, and were taken to Baghdad in captivity. But while the Jews there may have wept and remembered Zion, they actually did extremely well. They were the first successful diaspora community. They became very involved in commerce and in trading, and became so influential that when they had the opportunity to return to Jerusalem, many of them turned it down because they were doing so well in Baghdad. And over time, the Turkish rulers, the various rulers of Baghdad, began to turn to them for advice. And they named one family, one person, the leader of one Jewish family, to be what they called the Prince of the Captivity. And this person had almost a kind of royal role, or a secretary of the treasury, where they would consult with the pasha or the other leaders about issues of taxation and trade and commerce. And whenever this leading Jewish advisor went to meet the pasha in his palace, this advisor was carried on a sedan chair through the streets of Baghdad. And everyone, whether Jew or Gentile, politely would bow their head in respect as this person went by. That was a sign of the kind of eminence in which they were held. The Sassoons were this family. They were the most prominent family in Baghdad. They had extensive trading networks throughout the Near East and the Middle East. They were really treated almost as royal advisors to the king or to the pasha or whoever was ruling Baghdad at that time. Now, as often happens in Jewish history, politics turned against the Jews in Baghdad. By the early 1800s, the Turkish government was often kidnapping Jews and holding them for ransom, wealthy Jews holding them for ransom to support the government. And so David Sassoon, who was 37 years old, primed to take over this Sassoon empire, found himself imprisoned by the Turks, and his father rushed down and paid the ransom and freed him. But he also realized that things were not going to go well for the Jews going forward. And so he hustled his son down to the waterfront and put him on a boat that he had bought to send him off to safety. Before David Sassoon stepped in the boat, his father put a cloak around his shoulders. The cloak had gems and pearls sewn into it so that David Sassoon would have something to start with when he left everything in Baghdad behind. So in some ways, I think of this story as almost Shakespearean. It's a story of an almost royal family that loses everything and then spends the next century or two trying to get it all back. And in many ways, I think that's the way to think about the Sassoon family and what they accomplished. David Sassoon made his way to India, and he arrived in India just as the British were arriving and about to make India a colony. And what David Sassoon realized was that there were enormous commercial opportunities if he worked with and cooperated with the British Empire. Very quickly, he had his business acumen. He had these gems that he was able to turn into cash. And very quickly, he became a millionaire trading in India. He was able to get the rest of his family out of Baghdad, and they settled in Bombay. And David Sassoon decided that the future really lay with the British Empire. And so he insisted that his 8 sons, he had 8 sons, learn English. He brought in tutors to teach them English and British history. And even though he himself never learned English, he insisted that when Queen Victoria came to power, that all of his sons would stand on the waterfront in Bombay, and they all sang "God Save the Queen," signifying their loyalty to Britain and their loyalty to the British Empire. Now, the British Empire was always looking to expand, and one of the areas that they were looking to expand was China. China had been closed off to most of the world for centuries. And one of the main reasons the Chinese were resistant to British efforts to send explorers there or to trade with the British was because of opium. Opium was illegal in China, but it was also an incredibly profitable product. If you could smuggle opium into China, you could make hundreds of thousands of dollars with every landing that you had. And so the British companies in India and elsewhere were urging the Chinese to open up for trade. The Chinese would have none of it. And the reason was that opium addiction had become a terrible problem for China as it was trying to decide how to respond to the West. Just as a matter of comparison, about 12% of Chinese citizens in the 1830s, 1840s were opium addicts. Now, as a matter of comparison, in the United States, about 2% of Americans are opioid addicts. And we know here in America the incredible pain and suffering that's caused. And obviously the families like the Sacklers have now been sued and will be going to prison likely because of their involvement in the opioid trade. The opium trade in China was affecting 6 times as many people. And so we can imagine why the Chinese were so opposed to the sale of opium. But the British companies, Jardine Matheson and others, saw great profits to be made, and they persuaded the British to invade China twice in what were called the Opium Wars, the late 1830s and in the 1840s, to open up China to trade. The British gunboats defeated the Chinese, and the Chinese were forced to open up Shanghai, Hong Kong, and a number of other cities to British traders. Now, David Sassoon at this point saw a great business opportunity. He really had not been able to get deeply involved in the opium trade, but he then hit upon a number of entrepreneurial and really technologically innovative tools to use that enabled him to make great fortunes in opium. I sometimes think of this time in China as being like the American Silicon Valley, where it was a time when young men could sort of go and make their fortune. And there were just incredible business opportunities. And so the two things that the Sassoons did that really set them apart was they invested in steamships. Most of the opium was grown in India, and it was then taken on sailing ships to China, which usually took several weeks. But the Sassoons began to invest in steamships, which meant that the opium they got in India could reach China much faster. They could basically outspeed their rivals. At the same time, the Sassoons began to invest very heavily in the telegraph, which was a new technology at the time. And what the telegraph allowed was the various Sassoon brothers to communicate with each other in China and to communicate with their father back in Bombay and decide when was the best time to ship the opium, when was the best time to sell it, what was the market doing. As a result, within about 15 or 20 years, the Sassoons completely dominated the opium trade. They drove Jardine Matheson out of the opium business and became very successful. And they were able to kind of parlay that success into influence in London. David Sassoon began to send his sons to London, where he encouraged them to send their children to Eton, to send their kids to Cambridge University, to buy up mansions and to have parties. And through that, the Sassoons were able to befriend what became known as the Marlborough set. These were British aristocrats very close to the Prince of Wales. They would go on rest cures with him. They would even fund his gambling habit. And they would give him a chance to invest in opium because there was so much money to be made. Now, this question of opium, I think, is an important one because, you know, we like to think, you know, as Jews, that our Jewish values shape our decisions, and that, you know, Jewish businessmen have kind of maybe more of a moral background or moral consideration than others might. And so this is an issue that I tussled with when I spoke with the Sassoon descendants these days and read through their papers and trying to understand how did they justify the money they made out of opium. And one of the things the Sassoon descendants say now is that, look, this was a business decision. Like alcohol, like cigarettes, this was a vice. Opium was legal. In fact, the British taxed opium in India and used it to fund the colonial government. As I said, people in Britain, even the Prince of Wales, would buy stock in opium to make a profit. And that, you know, while it may have been distasteful, there was nothing amoral about it. But I think the question is more complicated than that. The Sassoons knew how dangerous opium was. They themselves never used it. And in fact, when I went through their business records, they were often complaining how many of their Chinese workers would become useless because they'd become addicted to opium. There were numerous efforts, both in the UK and the United States, to ban the opium trade. And certainly within China, the Chinese government, even though it was increasingly helpless before the sort of onslaught of the West, continued to campaign against opium. And so I think when we look back, you know, Balzac has this famous line where he says, behind every great fortune is a great crime. And I think for the Sassoons, that crime was opium. When the Chinese communists conquered Shanghai and seized the Sassoon business records in 1949, they basically were able to examine them, and I was able to see those records as well. And the Chinese concluded that the Sassoons made about $1 billion US. That's billion from the opium trade. And that money was then used to buy factories and real estate and to really fund what became one of the world's greatest fortunes. So I think this is a part of history that's complex, but is something that that has to be recognized. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the role of women in both of these families, because the role of women is often kind of passed over in history, and especially history from the 19th and early 20th century. As I mentioned, the David Sassoon had 8 sons. And after they had spent time in China, he began to send them to London, because he realized to be a global business dynasty, you really had to have a presence in London and understand the connections between politics and business. And the Sassoons were very successful socially, although there was still a lot of anti-Semitism. They would hold these grand parties that many British aristocrats would come to, and they would boast about their success. But then I was able to read the diaries of many of these British visitors, and they would say, I would never have these Jews to my home, or they really seem to be overreaching. In fact, Winston Churchill, who knew many of the Sassoons and was friendly with some of them, when the Prince of Wales became king, he wrote to a friend and said, I wonder if the new king will bring his Jews with him to Buckingham Palace. So even as the Sassoons were kind of rising, they were getting knighthoods, they were hobnobbing with the Prince of Wales and other royalty, there was still this undercurrent of anti-Semitism that ran through many of those encounters. But one of the problems that began to pose for the Sassoons is that all the brothers were in London spending money and living a sort of glamorous life, but there were fewer and fewer Sassoons in India and China, where the business was located. And one of the younger Sassoon brothers died unexpectedly, and this threw the family into a bit of a crisis. He was based in Bombay, and they couldn't quite decide who was going to take over running the business while they were enjoying all their grand parties in London. At that point, a woman named Flora Sassoon, who was married to this young Sassoon who had died unexpectedly, Flora Sassoon basically said that she would be willing to take over the business for a few years until their teenage son came of age and could take over and resume the kind of male line of succession. And her brothers-in-law in London thought that was fine. I mean, she was just a woman after all. She probably wouldn't, be able to do very much. They would be able to control her. And so Flora Sassoon took over running the Sassoon businesses in India and China. Well, as it turned out, her brothers-in-law completely misjudged her. Flora was a brilliant woman. She spoke several languages, was quite a scholar, and had a tremendous business acumen. Now, this was at a time in India when not only could women not vote, they couldn't even be seen in public. They lived behind what was called purdah. And so Flora Sassoon began running the Sassoon businesses from her living room. But over time, she began to, in a way, scandalize people by showing up at the Sassoon offices in India, by visiting factories, and taking much more of a public role. And then in a time, much like what we've been living through today, a pandemic came to Bombay, a bubonic plague. And the workers, the Sassoon workers, were so terrified of this plague that they stopped coming to work. And it really began to imperil the foundations of the Sassoon fortune. And so Flora Sassoon reached out, and she paid to have several European scientists come to Bombay and try to find a vaccine for the bubonic plague. They succeeded. And Flora Sassoon then insisted that she be given the vaccine and that a photograph be taken of her in public with her bare arm showing as she got the vaccine as a sign to her workers that this was safe to do. Now, again, many people found this scandalous, a woman showing a bare arm in India, but it worked. Her workers got the vaccine, they returned to work, And in many ways, she was able to save the business through her actions. But all this made her brothers-in-law very nervous in London. They realized she wasn't going to be that easy to control, that there was a real danger that she wouldn't give up power when her son came of age. And so they essentially staged a boardroom coup, which kicked her out of the business. They reasserted control. Flora Sassoon herself eventually settled in England, where she became a very well-known philanthropist and Jewish scholar, but she never set foot in the Sassoon businesses again. As a friend of mine said, she hit the bamboo ceiling. And it is, I think, kind of a sign of sort of the limits that many women faced, even from their own families, as they tried to advance during this time. Another woman I want to talk about briefly is Laura Kaduri. Now, Laura Kaduri married Eli Kaduri, who was the founder of the other family that I write about, the Kaduri family, which was another business dynasty. The Kaduris were also from Baghdad. And when the Sassoons were growing their business and opening up all these outposts in China, they were busy trying to find people to staff it. They were growing very quickly, and they needed people to run all their offices across China. And so they sent word back to Baghdad saying that if the families there wanted to send their sons, and they were always sons, to Bombay to work for the Sassoons would educate them. They set up schools. They would give them apprenticeships. They would build Jewish hospitals, which they did in case they became sick. They built synagogues so they could worship. And they even built Jewish cemeteries in China and in India. So in case their sons died, they could have a Jewish burial. And this was a way that the Sassoons were able to build a very loyal workforce and staff it with Jews from Baghdad. And it was an opportunity for Jewish families in Baghdad to send their sons off to a better future than they probably faced in Baghdad. So Rima Kaduri was the mother of the Kaduri family. Her husband died. The family was falling on hard times. And she decided to send several of her sons to work for the Sassoons. One of them, Eli, was 15 years old. And so imagine what it was like for him at 15 to leave his family, leave everything he knew in Baghdad, make his way to Bombay, where he began working for the Sassoons, was educated, was given an apprenticeship, and then at 18 was sent to China to start working for the Sassoons as a trader in a small city north of Shanghai. Well, even though Eli Sassoon didn't speak any Chinese, and even though Eli Kaduri didn't speak any Chinese, and even though he was working for the Sassoons, he soon realized that there was a great deal of money to be made in China. He left the Sassoons and struck out on his own, made his way to Hong Kong, and quickly began buying stock in companies, trading stocks, involved in all sorts of trade and commerce. And by the time he was 30, was a millionaire. And at that point, he decided it was time to find a wife. So he sailed to London, and there he met Laura Makata, who was from a very prominent British Jewish family. The two of them fell in love and got married. Now, at that point, typically, Laura would have gotten pregnant, and then Eli would have sailed back to China to resume his business and kind of continue to build his fortune. But Laura Kaduri was a very different kind of woman. She was actually older than Eli, was very adventurous, had done a great deal of traveling, and her family was quite worried that she might end up being a spinster because she was so independent-minded. She announced after their marriage that she was going to accompany her husband back to China and live with him there. And so they sailed to Hong Kong, and within a couple of years, she had two small children. And then she announced that she was going to accompany her husband as he traveled throughout China doing his business deals. And even more fortunate for me, she kept a diary. She kept a diary of her travels, and it's really remarkable because while her husband was off negotiating business deals and making money, she got to see China at the ground level. She saw the poverty and the suffering of the Chinese. She saw the civil wars that were breaking out, the way in which China was being invaded and carved up. And it really created in her a deep sympathy for the Chinese, and in many ways, I think, made her the conscience of the Kaduri family. Laura concluded that one of the reasons why China was suffering so much was that women were not educated. And so she made it her work to convince her husband to support the creation of Chinese schools for girls. Now, remember, this was in like the early 1900s. This was kind of unheard of, this sort of philanthropy. But the Kaduris began funding these schools for Chinese girls. They also began funding them in Baghdad for girls in the Middle East. And as she traveled, Laura Kaduri began to support more and more philanthropy for ordinary Chinese who were suffering, even while families like the Kaduris and the Sassoons were making immense amounts of money. The Kaduris eventually settled in Shanghai, in a mansion there. And at one point, a fire broke out in their home. Laura Kaduri ran out, but she was convinced that the Chinese governess, the servant they had hired to take care of their two boys, was still trapped inside the house. And so she ran back in to rescue her. She got disoriented by the smoke. It turned out that the governess had escaped through a different door. Laura Kaduri was overwhelmed by the smoke. She was caught in the flames, and she died in the house fire. Now, this was obviously a terrible tragedy for the Kaduri family, but it was also something the Chinese talked about, because it was almost unbelievable to them that a wealthy Western woman would run into a burning house to save the life of a Chinese servant. I think it reinforced the notion that the Kaduris were somehow different than other British imperialists and others who were in China. And I think, as I say, showed a kind of understanding of ordinary Chinese that not only the Kaduris, but then the Chinese themselves became, really fascinated by. I want to speed things up a little bit and talk about kind of, in a way, the most colorful part of this family history. And I want to talk about Viktor Sasson. Viktor Sasson, if a movie is ever made of this book or a TV series or something on Netflix, will surely be the star. Viktor Sasson was descended from the members of the Sasson family who had emigrated to London. He was a playboy. He was very wealthy, and even when he was at Cambridge University, he was considered to have one of the best wine cellars in London. As a young man, he was always seen with a chorus girl on either arm. He loved going to the horse races, and everyone dismissed him as one of those Sassoon playboys who was sure to spend a lot of money, but never make very much. He was handsome, and he was someone who was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in London. But during World War I, he was a fighter pilot, and his plane crashed, and he became a cripple. He lost the use of his legs. And because of his disability, he basically concluded that he would never be able to enjoy the kind of social life and social world that he had been enjoying in London up to that time. And so he decided instead to go to India and China to see if he could, make some sort of a life there. And as it turned out, he not only did that, but he also turned out to be a brilliant businessman. He decided to move all of the Sassoon investments to Shanghai in the early 1930s. And he turned Shanghai into one of the kind of great cities of the world. He built the hotel, the Cathay Hotel, which I had stopped into all those years later when I had to use the bathroom, and many of the other buildings that we see on that beautiful waterfront in Shanghai these days, that Art Deco waterfront. He really encouraged people to come to Shanghai from all over the world. And Shanghai became a spot on what was the Grand Tour. Charlie Chaplin came over to stay at Viktor Sasson's hotel. Noel Coward wrote Private Lives in a suite at the Cathay Hotel. Wallace Simpson, who would go on to make the King of England leave his throne, was photographed in Shanghai nude, except for a life jacket, which gives you a sense of what Shanghai's appeal was. It was glamorous, it was exotic, and was also a little bit naughty. And no one knew how to entertain like Viktor Sasson. Viktor Sasson would hold these grand parties in his hotel where he would dress up as a ringmaster and all the guests had to dress up as circus acts. He would dress up as a schoolmaster and everyone had to dress up as pupils. It was just a remarkable kind of excitement and glamour that he brought to Shanghai. At one point, I went to the Cafe Hotel when I was doing my research in Shanghai, and I was able to visit the penthouse suite that Viktor Sasson built on the top of the hotel. And from its windows, he could overlook his Shanghai empire. And as I was touring the suite, I went into the bathroom and I noticed that it had 2 bathtubs. And so I turned to the Chinese fellow with me and I said, why were there 2 bathtubs in this private bathroom? And he sort of blushed and he said, well, Viktor Sasson always said he didn't mind sharing his bed, but he didn't like sharing his bath. So again, that gives you a sense of what it was like to be Viktor Sasson in Shanghai in the 1930s. But starting in the late 1930s, these cruise ships that are coming, bringing Charlie Chaplin, Noel Coward, and others, begin bringing different people. And these are Jewish refugees from Berlin, Vienna, who were fleeing the Nazis. By 1938, the Nazis were entrenched in power. They had invaded Austria, and Jews across Europe were desperate to get out. But as we know, all countries, including the US, UK, Canada, refused to allow these Jewish refugees in. They had shut their doors. And so there was no place for the Jews to go, except, as it turned out, Shanghai. Because Shanghai was in part occupied by the British, in part by the Americans, in part by the French, in part by the Japanese who were moving in, there was really no functioning government in Shanghai. And that meant that as a Jewish refugee, if you were able to get to Shanghai, you could find refuge. And so thousands of Jews, especially in Berlin and Vienna, middle-class Jews, many of them, doctors, lawyers, merchants, professors, businessmen, began selling their belongings to book passage on these cruise ships, which would then take them to safety in Shanghai. And they began to arrive by the thousands every month with these cruise ships. And again, I just try to imagine what it was like. I mean, you see these pictures and films of these refugees all dressed as if they're going out for a walk in Berlin and Vienna in their overcoats and their hats. They suddenly land in Shanghai, where people are literally dying in the streets. No one speaks English or German. They don't speak Chinese. And they just didn't know what to expect. Much to their credit, Viktor Sasson and the Kaduris stepped up in a dramatic way. Viktor Sasson began to turn many of his buildings into dormitories to house these Jewish refugees. He hired many of them to work for him. The Kaduris started a school staffed by refugee teachers so that the children who were kind of, coming off these ships would have some place to go and some place to have some structure in their lives. But one of the more remarkable things Viktor Sasson did was he began to work with the Japanese to make sure that the gates of Shanghai were not closed to these refugees. At this point, the Japanese had already invaded China, and they were gradually encircling Shanghai. They didn't want to conquer the city yet because they were afraid that would antagonize the Americans and the British and might bring them into the war. This was before Pearl Harbor. But the Japanese were in Shanghai, and they appointed an anti-Semitic Japanese colonel, Colonel Inuzuka, to be in charge of the Shanghai Jewish problem, as they called it. And so he began to meet with Viktor Sasson. And Viktor Sasson basically played what to me feels like a con game on the Japanese. He was a charming man, Viktor Sasson, and he welcomed the Japanese officers. He said they were welcome to dine in his clubs, in his dining room. At the same time, he had his bartenders and waiters spy on them. But more importantly, he told the Japanese that because he was Viktor Sasson, because he knew Churchill, because he was so wealthy, he would talk to his friends in the United States and try to keep them out of the war. He would talk to Churchill and the British and try to keep them out of the war. He might even invest in some Japanese investments in other parts of China. and that he convinced the Japanese that allowing the Jewish refugees to come in the end, could be useful to the Japanese. And so the Japanese went along with this. At the same time, Victor was trying desperately to find other places the refugees might go. He flew to South America and tried to buy land there where the Jews might find a home or some kind of a haven from Nazism. Now, the Japanese eventually caught on to what Victor was doing. And just before Pearl Harbor, Victor had to flee Shanghai. But his influence was such that at this point, 18,000 refugees had found safety. And after Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese assumed full control of Shanghai, the Germans sent members of the Gestapo to visit their Japanese allies in China. And the Gestapo met with the Japanese in Shanghai and said, look, you have this Jewish problem. Here's how you can solve it. You should load all the Jews up, put them on barges, and sink them in the river. And that will solve your Jewish problem. Now, the Japanese refused to do this, in part because they still believed what Viktor Sasson had told them, that these refugees might be useful as a bargaining chip or as hostages in dealing with the Americans and the British. And so, remarkably, in what I think is one of the great miracles of World War II, of these 18,000 refugees who found safety in Shanghai, none of them were killed during World War II, even though the Germans kept pressing the Japanese to do it. Now, as I said, Viktor Sasson was able to escape before he was arrested by the Japanese. The Kaduris were not as fortunate. They stayed too long, and the Kaduris were interned into Japanese prison camps in Hong Kong and then in Shanghai, and Eli Kaduri died in Japanese captivity. When the war ended in 1945 and the Americans liberated Shanghai, many people thought that the party would just continue. It would resume as before. Viktor Sasson returned, so did the Kaduris. The sons of Eli, Horace and Lawrence, returned, and they believed that they could, resume life as normal. But of course, as we know, that's not true. The communists soon conquered Shanghai. Viktor Sasson left. He got a round-trip ticket from Shanghai, but he never returned. He lived out his life in a kind of exile in the Bahamas. He lost almost all his fortune because much of his money at that point was in property and real estate in Shanghai. And he became quite bitter about China. He said at one point, "I didn't leave China, China left me." He acted almost like a spoiled lover. The Kaduris were different. They actually fled to Hong Kong. And they decided to stay in Hong Kong, and they ended up rebuilding their fortune greater than ever. They worked very closely with the British colonial administration and helped power the dramatic economic miracle of Hong Kong. Always maintained connections to China, even in some of China's darkest days. And in the 1970s, when China opened up again to the West, one of the first calls the Chinese communists made was to the Kaduri family, welcoming them back to China. Today, the Kaduris are the wealthiest Western family in China. They own the power company in Hong Kong. They own the Peninsula Hotel chain all around the world. They've built nuclear reactors in China. They meet regularly with the Chinese leadership. They have met with Xi Jinping, the president of China. And yet, despite their increasing power and influence and wealth, I think like many Western families and businesses, they are very nervous today about where China's going, where Hong Kong is going, and they're walking a very narrow tightrope. I think concerned, will this be Shanghai all over again? And will they once again be forced to flee? So I'll stop there because I'm sure you have questions about this, and I'd love to hear your questions and comments. So I'll turn it back to Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. That was a fascinating insight, and the book is even more fascinating. So highly recommended if people haven't read it yet. Please put your questions in the Q&A now. Let's pick up where you left off, because I think you'd quoted or you'd said that Lawrence Kaduri felt as long as Hong Kong was interesting to China, useful to China, China would leave it alone. And I suppose he was right up to a point. But of course, in recent months, things have changed again. And I wonder, perhaps not just from the Kaduri's perspective, but what is your assessment about what's happening in Hong Kong at the moment?
Well, I think it's a very dark time for Hong Kong, obviously. And I think that what's interesting about the Kaduris, and I think this is true of many British families and officials in Hong Kong, they lived in a bit of a bubble. And they believed that as long as Hong Kong was important to China, the Chinese would leave it alone. And Lawrence Kaduri was very involved in the negotiations to hand China over. And he was very careful. It was interesting. One of the things that Lawrence and his brother decided was that while their father was a brilliant businessman in Shanghai, he had missed the rise of communism and had missed the fact that they had lost almost everything when Shanghai was conquered by the communists. And they were determined not to make the same mistake in Hong Kong. And so they always kept kind of channels of communication, some covert, some open, with the Chinese mainland. But I think that what the recent years have shown is that in the end, China is in the driver's seat. And it's interesting, Michael Kaduri now is the head of the family. He's in his 70s. And he was really the person who kind of committed the company to go back to China. He was the one who wanted to build hotels in China, to build these nuclear power plants. He's met with all the Chinese leaders. But I think some members of the family feel he's a bit romantic about China. And they're concerned that under the sort of new policy of China, will the Chinese allow the Kaduris to make all the money they're making, for example, from the power company and from other investments? And so, as I say, I think they're walking a tightrope. And I think the challenges they face are similar to what every Western business faces in Hong Kong right now, which is how do you deal with the Chinese in a way that both appeases them, but also retains your own morality. The Kaduris have endorsed the crackdown in China, the national security law. They have not criticized it. They're going along with it, as are most Western companies. And again, I think this raises, those kind of moral questions, which is how important is business, and when it clashes with your values, kind of how do you approach that? So I think it's an interesting time and a difficult time. Long term, perhaps China will become more open once again. I think that's certainly what the Kaduris hope will be true, as I think many in the West hope for. But short term, I think there are very tough times ahead for China and for anyone who does business or studies China.
But the Kaduris, I suppose it's almost in their DNA to be quiet about things. And I'm thinking particularly of the example where Lawrence Kaduri is pushed out of his position in the bank, which the Sassoons, in fact, founded, because the bank had acquired the Bank of the Middle East. And he doesn't retaliate, he doesn't argue, he just goes quietly. Do you think he went too quietly, or do you think that was perhaps the genius of his strategy?
Well, I think it's an interesting window into what it was like for them as Jews. Both families are interesting enough in what they did and their accomplishments that you'd want to kind of read about them and write about them anyway. But both families were always outsiders. And it really struck me that, the Chinese, I think, understood that the Kaduris and Sassoons were different because they were Jewish. And despite their immense success and their titles, Lawrence Kaduri, joined the House of Lords. He was very close to Margaret Thatcher. There was always this kind of social anti-Semitism which they faced. And I think that was shown most dramatically in 1967, as you say, when the Sassoons had founded the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, which became the most powerful bank in Asia, one of the most powerful in the world. It's now known as HSBC. One sign of the Kaduri's ascendancy in the way in which they finally passed the Sassoons in prominence was when Lawrence Kaduri was put on the board in the Sassoon seat. The seat that had always been saved for the Sassoons instead went to Lawrence Kaduri. But as you say, in 1967, because of various investments, the bank kicked Lawrence off of the board. He decided not to retaliate, but Lawrence Kaduri also played a long game. And one thing that's interesting is that when the handover was taking place, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank decided to relocate its stock listing from Hong Kong to Singapore and eventually to London. And the Kaduris did not do that with their companies. And that was something that the Chinese noticed and remembered. And so when it came time to do business deals, the Chinese favored the Kaduris on a number of very lucrative business deals and said openly that they appreciated how loyal the Kaduris had been to Hong Kong in contrast to some other British companies. So I think you could argue that Lawrence Kaduri was playing the long game, and he didn't allow a personal slight or anti-Semitism get in the way of what he saw as what would be best for the family and for his business interests. That's a discipline I think you really have to admire.
Indeed. Now, Carol Gold asks, how long did it take you to do your research, and how long did it take you to write the book?
Well, as I say, I started kind of gathering bits and pieces, many years ago, but I'd say the real research was probably about 4 or 5 years. And it was quite a task because, as you can imagine, these were global families. And so there were archives and papers and people I had to interview in Shanghai and Hong Kong and Jerusalem and London. And interestingly enough, in Dallas, Texas. Viktor Sasson, the playboy, never married in China. He eventually married his nurse when he was living in the Bahamas. When he was 65 years old, he married his nurse, who was a woman who came from Dallas, Texas. And as a result, when Viktor Sasson died, and then when his wife died, his papers went to the Southern Methodist University, a big university in Texas. And so I found myself at one point spending a lot of time in the university library in Texas. And I was going through Viktor Sasson's business diaries. This is where every day he would write down the businessmen he had met, the deals he was doing, the officials in the Chinese government he was meeting with. And as I was turning these yellowed pages, suddenly pictures of naked women started dropping out. And I was sort of embarrassed. I thought, oh my God, the librarian is going to kick me out. I mean, it's going to be thinking, what's this, crazy man doing with naked pictures? Well, it turned out one of the ways Viktor Sasson met women was he would go down to these ships that were bringing these celebrities from around the world and wealthy families, and would go up to these women and say that he was an amateur photographer, which he was, invite them to his studio, take pictures of them in the nude, and then go out with them or have affairs or whatever. And he kept these photographs in his business diary. And so again, it was something like that's why you do research, because you never know what you're going to find. And it gave me a real kind of insight into what was going on. Another challenge was that the Chinese were becoming increasingly concerned about Western researchers. So early on, I was luckily able to see a lot of the Chinese documents, which subsequently have been sort of, locked up again because the Chinese, for whatever reason, don't want Western journalists or scholars looking at them. So there was a bit of a race against time going on.
We have a question from Sandy Firth. My grandparents left Danzig and they thought they were going to Israel, but they were sent to Shanghai. They did end up in Israel eventually, but do you know about those ships?
Yeah, I think, oh, you're still muted, Jonathan.
I'm sorry, I don't know how that happened. These ships taking people into Shanghai.
Yeah,
from Eastern Europe.
Right. So, I mean, there were various ways in which people got to Shanghai, but the primary way was these ocean liners, many of them Italian, that left from Italy. And so you had to make your way from Berlin, Vienna, or Poland in some cases, down there. Some Jews actually went the other way. They took the Trans-Siberian Express and kind of came into China that way. But you know, as I say, it was a very harrowing time. And again, like as you say, your relatives, these Jews had no desire to go to China. It wasn't like they were going there because they knew anything about it. They just wanted to get out. And I think there were cases of many of these refugees thought they were going one place, ended up in Shanghai, thought they might leave in a few weeks or months, but ended up spending the whole war there. And one of the most poignant things is that, you know, the Jewish refugees in Shanghai were completely isolated. They didn't get much news from Europe. And so their assumption was when the war ended and they were liberated, that they would return. They'd return to Poland, they'd return to Berlin, Vienna, and resume their lives. And as the Americans liberated them, the American soldiers began putting up posters in shop windows that listed the fate of many of these towns that had been wiped out by the Nazis, or of families that had been wiped out. And you have pictures of the horror as the refugees in Shanghai realized that they were the lucky ones, that there was no home to go back to. There was, you know, that the life that they had left no longer existed. And as a result, as in the case of your family, they ended up settling in Israel, Australia, the United States, or the UK.
We have a comment from Gordon Franks. He is in Brighton and Hove, and he says that the Sassoons also had dealings in other materials, cotton particularly. I think you do mention this in the book. And he says that here in Brighton and Hove, there are many prominent Sassoon landmarks visible to this day. Albert, Reuben, Arthur, and Flora were all prominent in these two towns. Sheila Collins describes a visit to China some 15 years ago. She saw the buildings, some of the buildings you mentioned and wrote about. But she says also interesting to see the great Jewish influence in Harbin, right in the north. Jews at one time owned 75% of all trade and businesses. Did you know about this? Is this something you covered in your research?
Yeah, in Harbin, most of the Jews in Harbin came from Russia. When the communists took over in Russia, many of the Jews fled and made their way to Harbin. And even before the revolution, they were involved in the fur trade and other areas. And I think part of what makes it so interesting is that China was a much more cosmopolitan place than we give it credit for. I think when the communists tell the history of China, there was the Chinese Empire. It was colonized by the British and Americans and others. And then the communists came along and kind of, freed the country and have put it on the road to becoming a superpower. But as I think I show in my book, and as I talk about people like Viktor Sasson and others, China was a very globalized place. There were Jews in Harbin. There was a Jewish community in Shanghai, and these were very successful communities. And so I think in a way, we have to kind of reinterpret the history of China, of Hong Kong, of Shanghai, of Harbin, and recognize that they were much more cosmopolitan than we give them credit for. And I think if you visit China today or read about it, Hong Kong and Shanghai especially feel so different because of the influence of these families and other foreigners who were there in the early 1900s, the 1920s, the 1930s, who gave the cities a cosmopolitan flair that made them feel more like, London or Paris or Tokyo or New York, rather than kind of our stereotypical Chinese city.
Janet Stowe mentions a Chinese diplomat in Vienna who gave visas. I think you do cover this in.
Right, right. Yeah, his name was He Fengshan, and it's really a remarkable story. He Fengshan was someone who he was raised in the countryside, but made his way to Shanghai. He was very talented, was educated by missionaries. But then when he was in Shanghai, he absorbed this kind of cosmopolitan flair that the Sassoons and the Kaduris and others brought to Shanghai. He became a diplomat and was based in Munich and then in Vienna. And he was in fact in Vienna when Hitler entered Vienna triumphantly after the Anschluss. And he had become friendly with a number of Jewish sisters who lived in Vienna. And he began to wire back to the nationalist Chinese government that there was a very dangerous time for Jews, that the Jews were very nervous, and that the nationalists had to speak out against the Nazis. The nationalist government was reluctant to do that, in part because they were engaged in trying to get arms from Germany at this point, and part of their own fight against the communists. So He Fengshan took it on his own to basically set up shop in a cafe down the street from the Chinese embassy and give Jewish refugees basically exit documents. You didn't need a visa to get into Shanghai, but you needed an exit document to get out of Vienna. And so word kind of passed among the Jews of Vienna that if you went to this cafe, this Chinese diplomat would give you the paperwork you needed to escape. His wife his daughter rather, has done a great deal of work to kind of, get his story told. And he's now recognized both in China and in Jerusalem for a lot of the good work that he did. Interestingly, the Sassoons and the Kaduris are not recognized as much. Part of that is that Viktor Sasson never really talked about all the help he gave to the refugees. It was almost like Oskar Schindler. He sort of did this great thing, but then never talked about it and just went back to being, kind of a playboy and a member of the really British aristocracy, racing his horses and so forth. And the Kaduris, while they've talked about it, have been a more private family. So while He Fengshan has been recognized, these two families really haven't been. He Fengshan was one end of the pipeline, and the Kaduris and the Sassoons were the other end once these refugees got to Shanghai.
So just talking about Jerusalem, Elizabeth Baker asks which Sassoons now live in Jerusalem, and she describes attending Sheva Brachot at a Sassoon house in 1990. She says they were clearly very hospitable and still wealthy, friends of the groom, a cousin of hers. So I don't know, did you come across Sassoons in Jerusalem?
Yes, a number of the Sassoons did settle in Jerusalem. Someone became a very prominent rabbi there. And it was interesting when you were asking earlier about research. I was in Jerusalem and I was meeting a member of the Sassoon family who was a rabbi. And he basically had me come to his home about 10 o'clock at night. And so I went there and we were talking in his living room. And then he said to me, "What's the oldest document you've ever put your hands on?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know, probably the 1700s. American history is fairly recent. So maybe the 1700s. And he got up and went to a glassed-in cabinet and took out a piece of parchment. And he handed it to me and he said, "This is from the 7th century." And it was actually a piece of parchment that kind of outlined the job of the Sassoons as the prominent family in Baghdad, overseeing weddings and Jewish tradition and advising the Turkish leaders and so forth. And that's when it really hit me how ancient and formidable this family was. The Jews in England, by and large, are not very religious. They're certainly, they recognize their Jewish background. But Lord Sassoon, James Sassoon, who is the head of the family now, who is an advisor to the Cameron government, these are not prominent. They're not prominent in their Judaism. And a number of the Sassoons in England assimilated and converted. as many of us know, as Jews become more secular, they often drift away from religion. And so I would say that, most of the Sassoons in London, if they are observant at all, they're probably liberal, what Americans would call Reform Jews. And the Kaduris certainly, even though they were strong Zionists, are very much in the liberal Reform tradition in Hong Kong.
Malcolm Sender says, I knew Siegfried Sassoon. Who was his father? Which branch of the family did he come from? I think you do make passing mention of him.
No, Siegfried Sassoon is a very prominent British poet. He actually came from part of the family that had converted in London, and he himself didn't know that he was Jewish, I think, until he was a teenager. And it was actually quite interesting when he discovered his Jewish background. He actually wrote a number of essays denouncing the opium trade and the role of his own family in that. And so even within the Sassoon family, there was a lot of discussion and debate about opium. And I found it very interesting that Siegfried Sassoon, who's really known for his brilliant poetry, also was raising within the family, the source of their wealth.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for being our guest this evening and for sharing your knowledge with us and for answering so many of our questions. If anybody wants to buy this excellent book, please use the link on our website or in the confirmation emails you've got. The book's out in paperback now at just around £10, excellent value, even less on Kindle. And if you use our link, Milim will benefit a few pennies from each sale. Now, to thank you for being our guest, we're going to send you a bit of history of our own. This is a book called From the Leylands to Leeds 17. It's by the founders of Milim, and it's about the journey of the Jews of Leeds, where I am, from the inner city out to the leafy suburbs. And I'm also going to send you some of my photography. This is a study of Magen David Adom, the Israeli ambulance service. So they may take a while to reach you, but they'll definitely be
I look forward to reading them. Thank you.
Pleasure. Now, let me just tell our audience about some of our up and coming events. Next week on the 9th of August, we join with the Jewish Historical Society of England for a talk by Anne Kirshen, and this is about the Jewish tailors trade unions in Leeds. On the 16th of August, Tony Zendel is our guest with his postponed talk about his book Kosher Foxtrot. This is all about the Jewish connections, many Jewish connections to the golden age of dance bands here in the UK. That promises to be a fascinating talk. And finally, for now, on the 23rd of August, Marielle Schindler will be telling us about her book, The Lost Cafe Schindler, a family memoir centered on one of Innsbruck's most famous institutions. Our program does continue into September and beyond. Please visit milim.org.uk to sign up for our regular bulletins. All events are free, but if you do make a small donation on our website, that will help to support our work and the costs of providing these webinars. It remains for me to thank our guest, Jonathan Kaufman, once again. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining us this evening. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all again at a future event. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.